on this week's episode of the Rip City Roundtable podcast. I have a very special guest, Mike Barrett, former Blazers play-by-play announcer, was with the organization for almost, 20 years, doing various jobs and different things. Announced the Portland Fire when we had a WNBA team. Mike goes way back, and this guy, was the TV voice for when I was a kid watching Blazers games. So just getting to chat with him was unreal. But the reason why I had Mike come on this week, was kind of on a sad note because, Blazers and the NBA world, basketball world, lost a legend, and Mr. Bill Walton passed away, age of 71. And, he is one of the most unique, not just NBA players or celebrities, but individuals probably ever created, and Bill, both from a high school level and obviously his dominance at UCLA, comes into Portland as a rookie, gets a rough start, but then finds their groove, and in 77 leads the Blazers to our only championship, glorious year. And so, it was a short-lived run there, mainly due to injuries and things, but, forever will be in the lore of Portland, Trailblazers basketball, because it is our only championship. And so, but being able to see Bill come back from injury, play with the Celtics, win another championship, get into broadcasting, which is where a lot of people knew him from, and then, the Pac-12 and just his character, on screen, but on TV, but who he was just in life. And so it is incredible to have Mike come on the show and to share memories of Bill and his interactions with him. And so I know you're going to love this. This is a great episode. I was excited to have Mike come on here and get to chat with him. So, without further ado, I won't keep you busy. We want to get to the good part. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will have Mike Barrett on the Rip City Roundtable podcast. All right, we're back from break, and we are here. If there was a Mountain Rushmore of announcers, play-by-play for the Blazers, Mike Barrett, you for sure would be on that mountain. And thank you for coming on the podcast today on the Rip City Roundtable, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm humbled to hear you say that. I don't think of it that way a lot of times. And then I think back at history, and then when something like this happens, like this week with Bill Walton, and then I get a lot of calls to realize there's not many of us probably who were from that era who are around.
Yeah.
So I'm honored to hear you say that, and so there's some great days and such a big part of my life. All of this was, and the Blazers were, and so many of these guys. So I'm honored to come on and talk about stuff and share stories. It's always fun. Cool.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I haven't mentioned this to you, but I was driving here and I was like thinking, okay, how do I want to lead this off? And this came to me, and it was perfect because, your wife, Shelly, she was a teacher at an elementary school, and that's where I went to school. And so every once in a while, Shelly would bring tickets to the game. I think you would have some, or it would be just random. And she would just pick random students or just people that she knew, and she, hey, here's some tickets to the game. And I wasn't a big sports person growing up. I didn't really like basketball, and I was like whatever. And so, but we got these tickets, and we went to our first Blazers game because of the tickets she gave us that ideally came from you. And we go, and I fell in love. I don't even remember much about the game. I think we lost. It was probably, whatever. I don't remember. But that took me on this journey, not just as a Blazers fan, but just in sports. And then I joined the basketball team and, got into competitive things and just all that stuff, Mike. And you didn't even know it, but it literally stemmed from you giving those tickets to your wife, and those passed down to me, and it's been a great journey. So I want to say thank you. You didn't even know that, and you've had an impact on me.
I love stories like that, and it probably was. I'm trying to think when you were at West Hills, but it probably had to be back when there were a lot of tickets that during the middle of the day they would lay on a counter at work and say, "Hey, anybody want to come to a game?"
Yeah.
But no, those were fun times, and I love hearing, because sometimes in my life now I'm not as connected to that stuff anymore. But I'll have somebody, I'll be out at a store or something, and somebody will walk up, and it doesn't happen. It's been a few years now, 6 or whatever years.
Sure.
But I'll have somebody walk up and tell me a story, and then I met somebody. It was actually through the MLB project, and I was talking to her for a while. And then she turned her phone around and showed me a picture of her when she was younger that she had taken with me and Mike Rice after a game. I had known her for like a year now in this life. Wow. And had no idea. She goes, I was going to show this to you at one point, but I love that stuff still happens. And, it's great to think that you played a part in somebody's life, but we all do that for each other. I mean, I've got stories like that too. Yeah. I mean, even the first time, we can get into this later, but the first time I met Bill Walton, and then my dad was a coach, and all these reasons that I got into what I'm in, and there's linchpins throughout our lives, and there's funny forks in the road to where if you hadn't gone, if you had been sick that day in school,
yeah,
and would you be what you're doing now? I mean, there's a million things on our map lives that our life maps that led us to where we're at now, and it's weird to think about.
Yeah, and that's why like the whole when people have regrets, it's such a doesn't make sense. Like, don't go down that road because you don't know what that decision, if you did that or not, how that changes the next day and the next day, and you live the life that you have, and you kind of can reflect and look back at those moments. So you called it linchpins, right? I think that's a really cool term. Well, okay, so. Yeah. So let's dive. Let's get the backstory. So Mike and Mike was like the show. I mean, again, growing up, watching the Blazers, it was always you guys. Like it was like your voice in my brain, calling the game is how I remember games, right? And then if it's on the radio, it was Wheels, right? And so it's like that was it. Like that was my childhood. That was the Blazers. And so, but take us back. How did you get to that point? What was the journey that led you there, Mike?
Well, it's funny, and then I'll get to really how Mike and Mike thing started, because Bill Walton was kind of part of that story.
Yeah.
I grew up. Well, my early years were in Idaho, and my dad was a high school basketball coach, and so we moved around a little bit because he was taking different jobs. And when I was young, I guess I was 7 or 8, we moved to Albany, and he became the basketball coach at West Albany. And I was good at basketball, but baseball was more my sport. And so when I got out of school, I got recruited by Oregon State, and as a left-handed pitcher. And this was before Oregon State was what Oregon State is now. Yeah. They was a good program, but it wasn't elite like they are now.
Yeah.
But I went to junior college for a year and pitched. And toward the end of my freshman year, and I had a really good freshman year, I had arm trouble, shoulder trouble. And I went to Oregon State the next year. I probably should have, well, we talk about regrets. I probably should have stayed one more year in junior college, but I went there thinking that I'll get over this injury and I'll get my fastball back and everything will be fine. Well, I went there in the fall and I didn't have anything left. And back then they didn't monitor pitch counts like they do now. And I'm around the program, even at Wilsonville High School. I've got a lot of friends' sons play, and I watch how they manage pitch count and they manage arms for young pitchers. Well, I didn't really have that. So I guess you could say I threw my arm out, and I probably could have come back. But the reason I bring that up is, and we talk about these situations we talked about a minute ago, there's an umpire who was calling games, and I wasn't going to go this far back, but if you really want to know how this started, this is kind of how it started.
Usually I say, like, where were you born, Mike? And let's go there. No, so you're fine. Go as far back.
Right. So anyway, there was an umpire there who I'd gotten to know really well, and he was always a home plate umpire in high school, and then I think he was involved in the high school all-star game the series that I played in. And he was the sports information director at Oregon State at the time. So when I get done, I go to Oregon State, and I'm realizing in the fall I'm not a baseball player anymore. I mean, my shoulder's gone. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm enrolled in school, but what does that mean? I wasn't ever really a great student. Didn't take things that seriously because I, like a lot of kids, I thought, okay, my career is going to be in baseball.
Yeah.
So he said, well, since you're done playing, he goes, why don't you come up and work with us at the media relations sports information at Oregon State? And so I said, okay. It was at Burger King in Corvallis on 9th Street that I ran into him.
Yes.
If I had not had that conversation, and I think I've said this before, but not for a long time, if I had not run into him, if I had not chosen Burger King that day for whatever reason, and he had not been there,
yeah,
none of this would have happened. Gosh. Because I knew him, I was comfortable with him, and I said, okay. And I'd always been interested in broadcasting, even as a kid, because I was around sports with my dad being a coach forever. So there were tapes of me calling games as a little kid, sitting in front of the TV. But I didn't know at that point what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So once I started working with media relations and sports information, I just realized, okay, I thought I'd be a writer for a long time. Writing always came pretty easy to me. And I went ahead and I majored in journalism. Toward the end of my college career, there were some broadcast opportunities that came up with the campus TV station and radio station, KBVR. And oddly enough, the guy that I started working with as my producer director at KBVR was Jeff Curtin, who ended up being the director of broadcasting with the Blazers, who I worked with for years.
Yeah.
So Jeff and I go way back.
Cool.
So anyway, I get done with school, had called some games, didn't know what I was going to do, moved to Portland. And I was selling golf clubs. I didn't know, but I was looking for a place to live, and a friend of mine who was working at Channel 6 downtown said, hey, come, I got an extra room in my apartment. So I start hanging out with him a little bit, although he was working a weird shift. I didn't know what I was going to do, what I was going to be. And he says, hey, there's a radio station in Hillsboro. He goes, I know you did some broadcast stuff at Oregon State. There's a little station in Hillsboro that does high school games, and they're looking for somebody to call some high school boys and girls games just on the radio, just using the old Marty setup where you take the van, you lift up the antenna, get to the station.
Yeah.
So I did that for a fairly short time, but then because of my past at Oregon State, I knew everybody in the media because that was Gary Payton's senior year.
Oh, okay.
And so all of the media, all of the games were on TV. So I had worked in TV trucks as a student assistant. I had worked at the press table. I had held microphones. I had done everything.
Yeah.
And then even when the Blazers were in the playoffs in 90 and 91,
okay,
I was a runner for CBS Sports then, and then NBC took it over in 91. So I was around it. I got to know some people. But I didn't know that's what I was going to do. But then when I was calling those games, high school games, I probably called 10 to 15 high school games.
Okay.
This job at KXL Radio in Portland came open that somebody had told me about. They're going to hire a sports director. They had been using Rick Metzger at Channel 6 as their.
Oh, yeah.
Back then, radio stations did that, where they would take a sports guy on the local TV station and he would cut in and do a sports update. Well, they wanted to do more sports.
Okay.
I in no way was qualified for that job. I had done a few games calling play-by-play, and I remember I got an interview and lied about what my abilities were. Yeah, I know how to run all this equipment, these machines. I didn't know anything.
we'll call it exaggeration, Mike. And the lying's too far.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, okay, but it was yeah. So I go out one night to KUIK in Hillsboro, and I kind of get a crash course on how to run these machines. Back then, they were using cartridges as your sound. It's so different now. But I at least knew enough. And then I get a second interview. I remember telling my dad, I said, I'm getting a third interview at this radio station in this job that I in no way, shape, or form am qualified to do.
Yeah.
And then they throw me on the air one night to do sports updates. These are during news blocks,
okay.
And I do pretty well, I guess. I'm just in there giving baseball scores and reading the AP wire. And so they hire me, oddly enough. And it was for a morning shift and evening shift of morning drive, evening drive radio back then in news radio. And that was the thing. And it was in 92 when I got that job. It was in the spring, and the Blazers are making a playoff run. and they were trying to make a bigger dent in sports because KEX kind of had that market cornered. Mm-hmm. So they send me to the finals in '92 to Chicago. Wow. So I end up, being back there. That was my first traveling gig was the finals in '92.
Wow.
So I was around everything, and I was still being a runner for NBC because those guys wanted me to work for them again. So while I'm doing sports updates on the phone, these old cell phones, big block cell phone, I am the stage manager for Dick Enberg, Magic, all those guys, and I'm just handing them cards, is what a stage manager does, and you kind of take care of that. So I kind of fell in love with that, and I kind of thought that would be a cool thing to do. But 8 years go by, just to try to fast forward through, I was on the Oregon Duck football broadcast team as the sideline reporter for football. I did some basketball games, some play-by-play, got decent at it. And then in '99, the Blazers they had decided they were going to have a studio host for radio halftime. They needed a guy to kind of do some of the magazine shows, TV, and then they got a WNBA team as well in '99. So I hadn't really applied for it, and finally Scott Zachary, who you have talked about a little bit, you knew Scott. Scott was a director or a producer, for broadcast. He wasn't at that time. He came to me in the media room at a Blazer game one night, and he said, "Why have you not applied for this job?" I had gotten to know Scott pretty well, and I said, "I don't know. I just guess I haven't. I'm busy. I'm working a split shift. I was grinding. I was doing every job in radio."
Yeah.
He said, "Well, you should." So I did, and Harry Hutt, who was then the president of the Blazers, he hired me. And I basically was the studio host for radio, halftime, post-game. I was the WNBA play-by-play broadcaster on TV and radio. I was the editor of Rip City magazine, and I also wrote the game program. And so I would do all the Blazer game stuff, and then in the summers I would go call the WNBA games. And I also wrote their game program and all of this. I was doing everything.
Oh my gosh.
And so that continued for a couple of years like that. I was just kind of doing everything for the Blazers. And they had what was the show called? It was a show. My first, actually, I can say this. They threw me in the studio. They had the little studio, which is still where the studio is in Moda. And it was nothing like it is now. Mm. And I think it was to start the season. They called me and then they said, "Have you ever read off a teleprompter?" And I said, "No, but I've read copy for a long time on radio. I think I could probably figure it out." So I said, "Okay, Saturday night, we have a live show on KGW, NBC in Portland. You're on for an hour live reading off a teleprompter." And I said, "Okay."
Here we go.
And we pulled it off somehow. And then I guess it would have been in '02. They made some changes, and Pete Pranica, who had been the play-by-play broadcaster, he actually ended up in Memphis, where he still is as the play-by-play broadcaster. Hmm. I had gotten to know Steve Jones well, which was humbling for me because I had listened to Steve forever. His courtside shows before Blazer games were legendary. Yeah. I listened to those every night. I listened to every Bill Schonely broadcast. I was that kid. Yeah. So I knew everybody. I was very aware of the media as a kid. So we got into the fall. They hadn't replaced Pete. It was an awkward situation. I didn't know if I had the job. I knew they had interviewed some guys from outside the market. Again, I was young for the position. I was very inexperienced for the position. All I had was some WNBA games that I had done. But they liked me enough, I guess. They gave me the Blazers play-by-play role and called a couple of preseason games. And our season opener was at Utah. I still have some clips of that game, I think. I don't have many games, unfortunately, but I do have that one.
Yeah.
And Steve Jones and I took off and did the broadcast, and I did 3 years with Steve.
I forgot you did that with Snapper. 3 years with Steve before Mike.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And then ironically, it was at that time that Steve Jones and Bill Walton and Bob Costas were the number one NBC broadcast team. Yeah. The funniest. They were the TNT studio show before the TNT studio show, and Bill made that way. Yeah. And he would, Steve was very straight a lot of times, but you could get Steve going.
Yeah.
And I was young enough to where Steve was hard on me in a good way, but I could draw Steve out a little bit. Well, Bill could really draw him out.
Yeah.
And so Snapper being on that broadcast team, we would go off on a Blazer road trip then, and Steve would have to go off and do NBC games with his other gig. So they would move Rice to TV from radio to fill in when Steve was gone.
Oh, okay.
Well, Mike and I clicked. And I don't want to say Steve and I didn't click. It was just different. And Steve was getting busy enough, and that's when the contract went to ABC and ESPN. So he was doing these Times Square shows for ESPN, and then he started having some health trouble. Steve did. And so they just decided, hey, you know, why don't we, instead of sharing Steve and then patchworking the other broadcasts together, and then radio is hurt when Steve's gone because Mike moved over, so Rice is going back and forth. They finally decided just to name Rice the permanent radio analyst, or TV analyst. So he became my partner. I think that must have been in 05. I'm not sure if I have the dates right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
4 or 5.
Okay.
Rice became my partner, and then we did I guess 12 years together. So that's kind of a quick
that's
on how it started, how I got the job, and
yeah. No, that's great. It's like as you're telling those stories, I'm like piecing together like, okay, where was I when I was listening to you? And I do remember that. And I remember some of those, like where Walton would be on the cast with Steve on those NBC. I remember one game, and I can kind of lead into here and ask you some questions about Walton. But there was a home game, and it might have been a playoff game, and they gave plush dolls. You don't know? Okay, I
know where you're going.
And I want to say, and you can correct me here and again, I think Scottie Pippen got a technical or something, or something happened, and the crowd went ballistic and just started chucking the plushie dolls onto the court, and it was like all these Bill Walton plush dolls, and I would not throw mine. I kept mine because I was like, I'm not giving this up. But I just remember just the booze and these. So that did happen. I'm not like dreaming that, Mike. That was a thing.
No, you know that happened. What Scotty got ejected in that game.
Okay.
And I was up off the floor because I was doing radio, but people didn't see, and there just wasn't as many cameras, I don't think, then. Well, Scotty gets ejected, and he starts to head down the tunnel by the Blazer bench, and there are people who would corroborate this and remember this.
Yeah.
And for some reason, I remember this before the Blazer Buddy Walton balls rained out of the stands. Scotty grabs a tray from a waiter. It was a round plastic tray that they were serving, and Scotty throws the tray, and it goes off, and it lands on the court. Nobody really saw it. I saw it. Everybody said, but I think the league saw it. I don't think it was on camera. He would have been suspended, obviously. He throws this huge tray.
Yeah.
So it's during that, and that was a time when Rashid was at his worst with technical fouls and the 41 technicals and all this. So somebody throws a Walton Blazer Buddy doll on the floor. All of a sudden, it is raining. It's like a hat trick in hockey, but it's just I swear, every Blazer Buddy doll that was handed out in the lower bowl ended up on the court, and they're literally sweeping them off the floor.
Oh my!
Yeah, that was funny, and I remember Walton's reaction. And I wasn't watching that broadcast because I was doing one, but I remember looking at him as his dolls, his tribute dolls. They're just flying out of the stands onto the court. Those were interesting times.
Oh, interesting times. Oh my goodness. Well, let's use that as the segue. So, of course, a few days ago, we get the news that Walton passes away, age 71, and we talk about you being on the Mount Rushmore, for Blazers, play-by-play and announcing and things like that. I definitely would say Bill's on that Mount Rushmore for Blazers players, being there,
for sure.
MVP, delivering a championship and all those things. And so give me some memories and thoughts. I know you had mentioned kind of the first time you had met Bill. What were some of those first memories that came back when you heard the news?
Well, it's funny because I got to be around a little bit because my dad, being a coach, was a Jack Ramsey disciple. And so he had gotten to know Jack, and then he had gotten to know Rick Adelman really well in late years. And so I gotten to come to a training camp, and I was young then. And so one thing I remember about Bill is I tried to talk to him a couple of times. I was a little kid. And I remember being at Gill Coliseum in a preseason game. It had to be this had to be Bill's rookie year. I think this was 75. And I was really young, and I just used to walk around because I was used to, gyms and to that extent, a Coliseum in Corvallis. And it was a Blazer preseason game, and Bill had a headband on because he was even more hippie-ish his rookie year, if you remember. I mean, he'd wear a headband, like the braided headband and long hair.
Oh, yeah.
And he was on the bench. And he had been warming up, and it probably wasn't the best time to ask for an autograph, but I did anyway. Yeah. And so I went over there, and I just remember, you have memories when you I guess how old must I have been? I must have been 6 or 7. And I was walking around the floor by myself, and I just walked over to the bench and I asked for an autograph. And I remember he looked at me and then he said no. And he was warming up, it was the wrong time to ask. But he was covered in sweat. And I remember this hippie dude, and he's huge.
Yeah. And
so that was my first really interaction with him.
Yeah. And
then I had known him a little bit. I had done some radio shows, radio hits, never really knew him that well. But later on, in fact, it was toward the end, I started, I was the MC every year for the Maurice Lucas auction, the benefit auction, the ML20 auction. Okay. And Bill was always a speaker at that. And so he was always at my table. So he was so wonderful in the years that I did that, because he had then, what was humbling to me always is when I would meet somebody, like when I met, I was at we had an off day in Atlanta one time. We went to TNT and watched that show, and Charles and Shaq and those guys are all like, they knew me. They're all like, hey, yeah, you guys do they knew because they sit and watch games.
Yeah, yeah.
So those were always humbling moments. And I got that from Bill a little bit, because he was very complimentary of our broadcasts and felt he knew me to some extent. And then I was humbled because I'm like, man, you're Bill Walton. I mean, I remember watching you my whole life, and watching the championship run is, I think, a lot of kids my age, because I was in grade school then, when Blazer Mania really started, and Bill was the reason. And then my dad was such a fan of the Ramsey system and everything else. But anyway, back to those auction events. So I did a lot of events with him when I was at the Blazers too, and he would come back and do commercials. And people forget that there was a long time that he didn't come back. There was bad blood. There were bad feelings about how his injury was handled, how his feet were handled. It was one of those ended way too soon things, because people forget the year after they won the title, the 77-78 season, they were blitzing the NBA, and people said, this is going to be, this is going to be the championship team, and they could rip off 4 or 5. They're young, and then all of a sudden the injuries just destroyed that team. Then some bad feelings, and then Bill is traded. But in the later years when I really got to know him, it was at those events when I would not only introduce him on stage, and we would be on stage together, and we couldn't get him to shut up. And you're doing an auction. And they always say with an auction, you got to keep the crowd engaged. And Bill would get the microphone and he would go for an hour. And I've got the organizers of the auction saying, we got to move on. It would be, people have been sitting here for 3 hours, and Bill would keep going and going and going. But the cool thing about him, and everybody has said this now in the last few days, everybody has a story about it. When somebody passed like this, and then everybody's got a personal tale about their interaction with Bill. And I'm fortunate to have it. And you mentioned my wife, and Bill was so great to her. I always remembered her name. And if one thing is cool is I'm not great with names. Like I'll run into somebody and I'll say to my wife, who was that? I don't remember their name. I should know their name. Yeah. I hate that I'm not good at that. But one of the biggest things that impressed me about Bill is that he remembered everybody's names. And I had told him about my kids. I had showed him pictures. I don't think they'd ever met him, but he always remembered the names. Even the next year when he'd come back and I would see him again, he'd ask about my kids. He would talk to my wife, Shelly, how are you? And then he'd get up on stage and he'd talk about me and Rice and Kathy, Mike's wife, and Shelly, my wife. And he'd just remember these things. And it's a little thing, but it's not, because he was probably the best person celebrity-wise that I've ever known at affirming you and making you feel important and making you feel honored even in the little things. And I know he did that for everybody, not just me, but of course, my experiences with him, that stuck in my mind so much about who he was. And then something that we all should try to assimilate is his just absolute love of life. And one of those guys, kind of like my dad, I would say, and not the way that my dad would capture a room, because he wasn't like Bill in that way. But I said about my dad passed a few years ago, and I said about my dad when we were having a little memorial service, I'm not sure if I ever saw a moment where I thought my dad had a bad day. He just never did. Every day was great. He never got caught up in stuff. And of course, I'm not that way. I'm mad at myself, but I'm not that way. Bill is one of those guys on steroids like that, in terms of never having a bad day, loving every moment, noticing the clouds in the sky, noticing the trees. And it should rub off on all of us. It doesn't at times. And then it takes a moment like this. It takes an incident like this when he passes for me to even lay in bed the last few nights and think, my gosh, I got to be more like Bill Walton. Yeah. And I think the world would be a better place if we all thought that we should be more like Bill Walton.
Yeah. I mean, so well said. I think the thing that sticks with me is that you said he would affirm you and just make you feel super important and remember your name. And that takes intentionality. Like, that isn't something that you can really fake. Like, you have to really be about that. And like you said, is that celebrity status. There's probably, and you've been around hundreds of celebrity athletes and probably other celebrities, and probably a lot of them are courteous and nice and shake your hand, and then they go about their day just because they do that with a bunch of people. But for somebody like Bill that can remember a name of your wife and genuinely look you in the eye and make you feel important for that 1 minute, 2 minute interaction or however long it is, I mean, that is a skill set that is just remarkable, regardless of if you were an MVP in an NBA league or some person that did something else not in the spotlight. Like, that is such a unique individual. And you're right, it takes, like, when someone dies to go back and remember those things, but sometimes there has to be that trigger to, like, make you be a better person, and all those things. So that's a really good take.
Yeah. And there are a couple of guys, as you're saying that, I'm thinking of Bill walking through the Blazer offices, which he did a few times, and just knowing everybody's name. The other guy who was also like that, who knew everybody's name in the organization, who would walk cube to cube on a game day, was PJ Carlesimo. And his time in Portland is kind of forgotten a little bit. And I got to know PJ because I was covering him then, because I didn't work for him yet. And I got to know him a little bit then. But then afterwards, when PJ became an analyst in the playoffs, that's when I got to know PJ. And he, of course, had watched our broadcast, and so was happy that I had gone from a kid doing radio to where I was at. And it really wasn't, and I had spent a lot of time with PJ, but when we were playing Houston in the playoffs, must have been in 14, I want to say. I hadn't thought about this, but we were in our hotel. It was Chris Webber. We beat Houston in games 1 and 2. LaMarcus Aldridge had the massive games in games 1 and 2. We go down there and upset them really in games 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Those 2 nights, and we during the regular season, you don't go get a beer after a game because you're off to the next game. You're on the plane. Well, the playoffs, you're kind of in a town for a few days.
Yeah.
So we go into this little bar at the hotel, and it was Chris Webber and PJ, and I got to sit with PJ for those few nights. Just had a blast. But I brought up PJ only because he's another guy who I admired, because he never forgot your name. He never forgot your story. Yeah. I wish I was better at that. But he and Bill Walton are probably on the Mount Rushmore of guys who remember everything about you and your name and your wife's name and your kids' names. Yeah. And I just admire that so much. And I want to be more like that.
Yeah. Well, when these giants of the game, when they have just these quick moments with an individual and may never see them again, for them to remember names and things like that just sticks with people and becomes those like linchpin moments that maybe they're having a bad day and they're like, wow, Bill Walton remembered my name, and that puts you on another trajectory. So, well, good stuff, Mike.
It's like the whole, it's the whole thing of, and I don't want to go too long here. I get long-winded, but it's the whole thing of, and in kind of something, I have a podcast now, which it's a little bit more spiritual. It's a little bit more of a Christian men's broadcast, but we talk a lot about, when we talk to men, about this whole idea of taking every thought captive. And anybody who's spent any time in study or anything else has heard that line. And the one thing I always try to remember, and the one thing I try to encourage people with, and this really applies to these people we're talking about, like a Bill Walton, is if you take every thought captive, literally every thought captive, not only does it keep you out of trouble and keeps your mind clear, and it keeps you out of some of the pitfalls that we fall into as men and women in terms of just the life being overwhelming. But I think, and I wouldn't have thought of this before, but I think in terms of even like honoring people and making them feel important, like Bill Walton always did, is I got the feeling that even as he was noticing nature, which he always talked about, and every city he was in was the greatest city in the world, and whatever moment he had was the greatest ever. It was because he had mastered the thought and the idea of taking every thought captive. And that's what I think about when I think about him.
That's interesting. We have a good friend, and she thinks, her name's Kathy. Shout out, Kathy. She thinks everything's the greatest. This is the greatest movie. This is the greatest dinner. This is the greatest person. And a lot of times, like our friend group, we're just kind of like, whatever, man. We make fun of it a little bit. But in reality, man, I want to live like that too, and that, of all the things I've read about Bill and watching the documentary and talking with you, like, that totally was his approach, and that wasn't fake. Like, he definitely thought this is the greatest day. This is the greatest thing. And we do. We just need even a little bit of that, Mike. If we had a little bit of that, I'd take it.
The world would be a better place for sure. And, and I think about, and the last thought about Bill, I was talking about the first time I met him, and of course, speech impediment and a stutterer and a mumbler. You even go back in some of his early interviews, and in the championship year, he didn't like doing media. He was uncomfortable in interviews. He put his head down. He would mumble. He knew he had a hard time talking. And it's almost like at that point he was, I don't want to say reclusive, but I do remember a story after the Blazers won the title, and we were from Idaho, when I was young. And so we knew a lot of people over there, and then people that can corroborate the story and know about it.
Yeah.
So he rides his 10-speed bike down to the championship parade. It's kind of legendary. He just hops on his bike, and somebody steals his bike at the championship parade. Well, 2 weeks later, when they're talking about what you're going to do now and how much you love the spotlight, and Bill seemingly was somebody who would seek out the spotlight. Well, it wasn't that way. And in fact, I think it was the opposite. I had a friend of a relative of mine in Idaho, and they're up in northern Idaho at a lake, a campground. This is not a month after they won the championship. And they're walking around this lake, and they're sitting by the lake on a blanket is Walton in a pair of jean shorts and nothing else, sitting there by a lake. And then he had come into a little store in this little tiny town, and they he's 6'11", he walks in, red hair. People recognized him, and he didn't really want to talk. But I think about that because as much as he liked the spotlight, he clearly, he loved nature. He always talked about that. Yeah. But that's a funny story that I was always told by my dad, that he just got the heck out of here after the title. He didn't go on a cruise or to Jamaica or some island. He went to some lake out of nowhere in Idaho and was just sitting there by himself.
Yeah.
And then to think that, he went from having the trouble he did communicating to what he meant communicating in the rest of his career, and how he's really known by, obviously, this generation is probably much more as a broadcaster and as a personality than as a player. Mm-hmm. And clearly he was an amazing player, an NBA MVP and the legend at UCLA and everything else. But somebody who took that many different paths in their life and impacted that many people. Mm-hmm. It's a shame he's gone, but in some ways I'm sure he would be happy that so many stories like this are being told about him now, and how many people loved him, and how many people are trying to profit from the example he set in clearly just absolutely loving people and loving life.
Yeah. Well said, man. Yeah, 100% agree with that. He's smiling right now. He's appreciating it, and he just wants everybody to probably say this is the greatest. It's all the greatest. So,
absolutely. Greatest day ever.
greatest day ever, greatest thing. Well, cool, Mike. Well, hey, I wanna wrap this up with just talking about, and you alluded to this a little bit, but kind of what you're up to now. You know, you're talking about the faith-based podcast, or tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's called Vertical Pursuit. My pastor, who's one of my best friends, Mike Tatlock, he is actually the team chaplain for the Blazers. Mike was a fill-in chaplain. So before every Blazers game, for every game, every NBA game, every team has a team chaplain in every sport. Most people know that. So before every game, visiting and home teams, not all of them, but usually 8 to 10 of them, will come together for a 15-minute chapel service. And it's usually just a thought or two, maybe something to think about. They pray together, and then it's always usually like in a weight room. I know the Blazers one is. So Mike began, I had suggested him as a replacement then. LA, of course, was the legendary team chaplain for the Blazers, and Al was starting to get busy and phasing out. So Mike took over probably in 15, probably became the full-time Blazers team chaplain. And the relationships that he has with these guys, and these aren't stories that are ever talked about. But Mike ended up doing C.J. McCollum's wedding. He did Myers Leonard's wedding. He's a huge, he and Dame Lillard, I know to this day, talk a couple times a week.
Cool.
Just one of those guys to lean on for the players. So kind of because of the chaplain work that he does, and he does so many things, I thought, well, and he's a great pastor. He gives great messages. But we started a podcast a year or so ago, and it was kind of based on the same thing. He goes in and talks about, and it's designed around, I suppose, men and struggles for men, and kind of not keeping stuff bottled up. And I had a couple of friends and people in my circles who had committed suicide, and you just start realizing how much pain there is for a lot of people and a lot of men. And we take on a lot of those issues. We don't always have the answers. We don't try to say that we do. We try to get conversations started about some of these things, but it's because of the chaplain work that he's done. And a lot of the chapels that I fortunately got to be in and hear him talk, and then to see these players who really didn't have that resource necessarily, because you got coaches and you got your teammates. A lot of those guys don't have a lot of really close friends that they can confide in, and kind of a cohort, as we like to call it, to go through life, people to keep you accountable, people to give you a chance to, talk about things that are painful in your life. And we've talked a lot about guys don't want to come home and break the peace at home a lot of times by dumping out their crap at home.
Yeah.
So where do you do it? Yeah. And so I think the podcast was kind of, at least one of the major goals of it was to get guys thinking about these things, and to get them talking, and to get them together, and to get them into groups. And like I talked about, some of our episodes are very faith-based, where we talk about what the Bible teaches. Some of them aren't. Some of them just are regular stuff that everybody struggles with. But it's one of those things that, in a lot of the stuff that I'm doing now, which I can get into just briefly, this is one of those things that I feel like I was kind of gifted with with communication and being a broadcaster, being able to talk, being able to formulate things. This is one of those things. I still have kind of a little foot in the broadcast area, even though it's a podcast and everybody is a podcast now. But it's been really rewarding and really fun. It's not something that we'll ever monetize. It's not something we make a dime doing. We just do it because we feel like it's necessary. And then we hear stories, like I'm sure you do, of somebody who heard one of our podcasts, or some stranger will get a hold of us via email and say, my gosh, I didn't think anybody else thought the way that I'm thinking. I didn't think anybody else was struggling with what I'm struggling with. So to hear those stories make Mike and I realize that it's a very valuable podcast to do for some people. And if we can just affect one guy, if we get one guy into communication, into community, into a situation where he has support and can talk about the things that are bothering him, then we've won. And I think that we have done that and more. So anyway, if you want to check it out, it's on Spotify, iTunes. There's an app, Vertical Pursuit. It's the EP app is what it is. So I appreciate it. I appreciate you letting me talk about it. And again, I'm not trying to promote it monetarily. It's kind of a cool thing we're doing. I am still involved with the Portland Diamond Project, trying to bring Major League Baseball to Portland, and we're still grinding away. It's been like 6 years.
Good.
Things are going well. I never can get into much detail because so much of it is confidential.
Sure.
I'm not the smartest guy in that group. I'm just kind of out front, and I know what's going on there. I kind of like, I'll do interviews now and then when there's something to talk about. I don't know what our timeline is, but I know we're getting down to where we're going to know one way or the other. Okay. I still do a lot of commercials. I am the voice of Bimart still. I've done them for years. I do a lot of work for Traeger Grills. I do a Toyota dealership, a Jeep Ram dealership, a four-wheel drive company, a golf cart company, an RV company. Kind of just as they're now that content has divided into, from just TV commercials and radio commercials now to digital and so many different ways to get your word out as a company. I do a lot of that with Nick Livingston, who is my partner in that, who was a producer of mine with the Blazers. Cool. Nick is an amazing photographer, editor. We have a lot of fun doing that. We storytell. We do some pieces where we've shot some real estate, some big ranches in Eastern Oregon, and we do kind of a documentary. That stuff's really fun for me. I never really got to do a ton of that in my NBA days, a little bit. Yeah. And we could storytell on live TV, but now I get to write and do it. So yeah. Well, a lot of things. I don't know what I'll be when I grow up one day, yeah. But I'm having fun.
Well, Mike, two things I've learned about you, and telling you when you were telling your story about all the different things you did when you joined the Blazers. Back then, you were running 9-10 different things, right? So it doesn't surprise me that you're able to do that now. But you are one of the most skillful communicators that and obviously maybe I'm biased, but it doesn't matter if it's calling Blazers games or making content for musicians or have a podcast or anything. Like, those things translate, Mike. And so I'm so happy to hear these things that you're doing. And you talk about, the podcast, and, we work with podcasters, and the first question I always ask is kind of the why behind the show, and it's okay if they say, mm-hmm. I want to do this concept and I want to try to monetize it and make some extra money. Totally fine. That's your why. I get it. Let's help get there. But the shows that typically have, I think, a better reach sometimes and can hit that impact is when it's like, hey, I want to reach a certain person, or I want to tell this story. I don't care if this makes a dime, but if it changes one person's life, then it's worth it. And I think that I love that's what you're doing with Vertical. And I mean, I will push it. I will promote that. I love that you're doing that. I think from a men's approach to life, like you said, it's, you get up, you go to work, stuff's happening, you go home, and you don't want to just throw that up when you get to the house. And then now you just get in this rhythm where that could almost go months without really sharing or getting to the bottom of what's going on. So having those outlets, I think, is so important. So important. So I love that you're doing that.
Yeah, it is. No, I appreciate you saying that. And that is the catalyst behind some of that was, a couple of the stories of guys. I know there was a guy who I didn't really know that well, but I have friends who know him well. And, he killed himself, and his friends are like, that guy, he was great. He was the coach of his kids' teams. He was always happy. Well, clearly there was something underneath the surface that nobody saw and nobody knew about, and he wasn't comfortable talking about. And so I think those were inspiring things. And our podcast isn't insanely heavy. I mean, it sounds like it when I talk about stuff like that, but it's just conversation. And usually they have a theme, but not always. But it is fun. And Mike is a wonderful communicator in his own right, and a wonderful human being, a great pastor, a great leader of men. So I love doing this with him, and it's probably among the most rewarding things I've ever done. And I don't know who's listening. We don't gauge it. Might be 20 guys, might be 2,000. I have no idea, but it doesn't matter. And that's the beautiful part.
Yeah, for sure. I love it. Well, Mike, hey, thank you for taking the time out of your day to come on and talk about your story, sharing some memories of Bill, and catching us up on what's going on in your life. So I appreciate the time, man.
And anytime. I'd love to do it. I love, obviously, getting on and talking about stuff and stories, and it's funny how I don't do it that often. It comes to something like this. So cool. You've made me think about these things and rekindle memories. So thank you for having me.
Cool. All right, buddy. Well, hey, appreciate the time. We'll see you later.
Okay.
All right, that's the episode. We're so grateful. Thank you for joining us. I know you enjoyed listening to Mike Barrett tell stories, both about his time with the Blazers, his memories of Bill Walton, just both of those. I mean, just incredible. I literally forgot we were doing a podcast. I was just listening and enjoying all the takes that he had. Just his time with the team. I mean, I think Mike probably had every position at the Blazers at some point, maybe besides general manager or owner, and so just what a tremendous treat. Great to see what he's doing now, his podcasting career taking off and all the content he's making, things he's doing. Like, Mike's a guy that he ain't going to be just sitting on his couch doing nothing. The guy's a hard worker, very skilled. It was incredible to have him on the show. I hope you enjoyed it. I was glad he got to come on the round table and chat with us about some Rip City memories and basketball. So anyway, thanks for joining. Again, just remembering the life of Bill Walton and all the love that he had for people and his life and just the largeness of it. And just how everything was the best day ever, the best game ever. And maybe you think this is the best podcast ever. If we had Bill on, he'd probably say that. So anyway, shout out to him and his family and for everything he's done for the community, basketball, life, humanity. We love you, Bill. And thanks, Mike, for coming on the podcast. And remember, it is a great day to be a Blazer.